On behalf of MPOWER Financing, I welcome you all to our webinar on COVID-19 and US visa. For the speaker of the day, we have Mandy from Argo Visa joining us, who has been a multi-country diplomat for the US government, something that is really needed in this interaction, and the kind of insight she could bring to this online session. I believe this would be a pretty helpful thing for a lot of students joining us. Mandy, I'll be transferring the presentation rights to you. So,
hi everyone. Hopefully you can see my screen and the first slide of my presentation. I'm so excited to be here, and I'm very excited to work with MPOWER and work with international students who are interested in coming to the United States to study. You know, as a former US diplomat, I am very proud of the US's education system. I think it's the best in the world, and I always get really excited when I meet people from other countries who are interested in learning more about the US and coming here to study. So my name is Mandy Feuerbacher, and I am a former US diplomat, a former US consular officer, or a visa officer, as they call us, and also a US immigration attorney. And so today what I'm going to talk to you about is, you know, a little bit about preparing for the visa interview process, but also commenting on the impact that the coronavirus has had on basically the US State Department, visa interviews, everything. So it's been a crazy few months, as I'm sure it has been for the rest of you, and just really happy to shed some light on what's going on. So a little bit about my background. So this photo was actually taken on the day that I was sworn in as a US diplomat, or a foreign service officer, that's what we're called. And they had a big ceremony in DC, and about 90 of my colleagues and I were sworn in on the same day. We took the oath for the State Department. It was very exciting. My mom flew in from California to witness the occasion. And for me, it was a very proud moment and very exciting because I'm actually an immigrant myself. I moved to the US when I was very young, about 7 years old. And, you know, I actually remember my visa interview. So it's very interesting to come full circle. So what was even more exciting than this day, however, is the week before, when we have another ceremony called Flag Day. And that is the day when new diplomats like myself find out the country that we will be going to and living in for the next 2 years. And so as everybody tells you, you should learn all of your flags, because what happens is at the ceremony, you get called up on stage and they hand you the flag. And so if it's a flag that you don't recognize, you might be in trouble because you don't know where you're moving to for the next 2 years. So it's kind of an interesting process. So by swearing in day, you already know where you're going. It's a little less nerve-wracking. So here's a little bit about my background. In 2008, I graduated from Pepperdine Law School. That's in Southern California in Malibu. And I practiced civil litigation as an attorney for 3 years. So after doing that for a while and, you know, really enjoying being an attorney, I decided I wanted to do something a little bit more. I wanted to be involved in public service. I wanted to serve my country. And I also really just wanted to travel everywhere and really see the world. So from 2011 to 2013 is when I decided to join the State Department as a US diplomat. And it's a very long process. You have to take, you know, multiple tests. You have an all-day interview. It's a very rigorous process. But I'm excited to say I made it through. You know, my husband and I actually decided to do this together. And our first assignment was at the US Embassy in Beijing, China. And so, not sure if any of you know very much about our work in China, Mission China, as we call it, but it is very, very busy. My husband and I were both consular officers or both visa officers for our first tour. And in China, because it is very high volume, on a daily basis, we would have over 4,400 people come through our waiting room. And every single person needed to be interviewed, and you had to make a decision for each one of those people whether or not they would get a visa before you can close up the embassy for the day. So it was a very busy time, a very difficult job. And so on average, I would say a consular officer working in Beijing or any other high volume post, places like India, places like Brazil, Mexico, you would regularly be interviewing about 150 people a day. So if you can imagine from the perspective of a visa officer, you were talking to a lot of people and making very quick decisions on whether or not this person should go to the United States or not. So it was exhausting work, and there were so many things I learned during that time that I, really wanted to share with visa applicants or people, who are interested in going to the U.S. and going through this process, because really we're the only people who know, how visa officers make these decisions. So during that time, I also got to meet some really amazing people. Here's meeting Vice President Joe Biden at the time, who's currently our presidential candidate. Very nice guy. He came to the embassy just to meet with all of the diplomats on a Saturday morning. So it was a great opportunity. I also got to spend a little bit of time with former President Jimmy Carter and his wife, Rosalind Carter. The Carters love China, and they would visit at least once a year. And Mrs. Carter, First Lady Carter especially, loved going to the local markets to go shopping. So when the embassy knew that she was making a trip, they looked for a U.S. diplomat who spoke excellent Chinese and who also loved shopping. So that was a perfect fit for me. So every time Mrs. Carter and President Carter would come to China, if while I was there, she actually specifically asked for me, and I would take her all over town and, negotiate on her behalf at the markets for all of these gifts that she wanted to buy for her grandkids, and also just really spend some time with her and talk to her about life in the White House. So that was really, really fun to get to know her, and they're so down to earth, such amazing people. This is the ambassador to China at the time, former governor of Washington State, Gary Locke. And he was actually a really, really big deal in China because he is the first Chinese American ambassador to be sent back to China to represent the United States. So that generated a lot of interest among the Chinese people. They loved him, and he was a really, really nice guy. And my husband was actually his assistant for almost a year when we were at the embassy. And so we really got to know him and his family. And then from 2014 to 2016, we were sent to the U.S. consulate in Mexico, in a smaller town called Matamoros, Mexico, which is right on the border, right over the southern border of Texas. And again, I was a visa officer. I spent time in American Citizen Services, working with American citizens in Mexico, and really got to know some interesting visa issues on the border. So, for example, because we were so close to the United States, we actually had a lot of students studying in Texas or in other locations close by who would want to travel to, instead of going all the way to their home countries to apply for a renewal visa, they would drive down to Mexico to apply. And I can go a little bit more into detail a little bit later about some of the issues there. But for the most part, it's interesting. Consular officers do not really like it when visa applicants apply outside of their home country. And so you always have a home consular district if you are a overseas visa applicant. And for example, I'll just use China as an example, and you hold a Chinese passport, but you're studying at the University of Texas in Austin. If you drive down to Mexico and apply for a visa, a visa officer may not really like that because they might look at your passport and say, well, you live in Beijing. You should be applying at the embassy in Beijing who better understands your situation. As I'll go into a little bit later, it might be somewhat different due to the COVID-19 pandemic. But for the most part, that is our rule. We like people to apply in their home consular district because as visa officers, we're very aware that there is a perception that there are certain embassies and consulates around the world where people think it is easier to get a visa there instead of in their home countries. And for the most part, we want to minimize what we consider foreign shopping or visa shopping. And so what could happen if a visa officer is unhappy with your decision to apply outside of your home district is, number one, they can refuse your visa and say you're not applying in the right place. Or number two, they could put your visa application on pause and again, send you to your home country, but at least you don't have to pay the fee again. For the most part, what I've seen visa officers do is the first scenario where they just refuse your visa and then you have to go through all of this trouble because they'll cancel your visa, so you can't actually go home and fly from the US. You'll have to fly directly from where you are at to your home country to apply and wait for the issuance. So it's a huge hassle. I don't recommend it unless there are special circumstances present. So in this photo, I am being interviewed by the local TV station on student visas. Visas are always the most interesting topic for everybody in foreign countries because they all have more questions about it. They all want to know what is the best way to get their visa approved. And so, it was fun being interviewed, but it's also nerve-wracking because I had to conduct the interview in Spanish and my Spanish is a bit rusty, but it was fun as well. And so as you can see, this is the waiting room in our consular section in Matamoros. We did an entire TV special bringing the local TV station into our consulate to show them a day in the life of a U.S. diplomat and the kind of work that we do. And interestingly enough, in Mexico, it was still very, very busy. But during the times that they weren't busy, they would send us on temporary assignments to other locations in the world. I would have, colleagues who went to work in Brazil for a while. I myself got to go back to China and work at the consulate in Guangzhou and the consulate in Chengdu. And so really get to experience what visa work is like in other locations. So as a visa officer, you can really work anywhere in the world. And we tend to speak a common language because we understand what you can see in the computer systems. We would have weekly meetings on how we make these decisions. And so we really just have this wealth of knowledge that nobody else really understands. So from 2016 to 2018, I was sent to the U.S. consulate in Hong Kong. And while I was there, in addition to working in the non-immigrant visa unit, I also worked as the chief of the immigrant visa unit and learned all about green cards, handled all sorts of immigrant visa petitions and visa interviews, including investor visas, diversity visas, extraordinary ability visas. So that was really interesting. And also, again, spent some time in American Citizen Services. So here I am as the MC of our 4th of July Independence Day celebration. And the man standing behind me is the Consul General of Hong Kong at the time, who was also the basically the ambassador of Hong Kong. So towards the end of 2018, I decided to leave government service and come back to California. And I started my own U.S. immigration law practice and started working with a lot of clients all over the world who were having issues, not just with immigration, but also with visas. And I quickly realized that one of my favorite things to do is to help clients prepare for their visa interview because it's something that I understand so well, but so few people do understand. And so that's when I really realized the need for Argo, which I'll go into in just a second. So when I did my own law practice, I was actually invited to UC Berkeley to give a talk to their students about the transition from F1 visa to H1B visas, because as many of you know, once you go to the US and you study there, if you like it, you enjoy being in the US, a lot of people would like to get some work experience and see what it's like to actually work there and live in the US long term. So it's a very tricky transition, and it was really fun to speak to the Berkeley students about that. And then 2019 is when we launched Argo. So just a little bit about Argo. Argo is the world's first company made up entirely of former U.S. consular officers or visa officers who help clients prepare for their visa interview. And the reason that Argo was started is because when you have done the job that we have done and you see so many people get refused visas because they just don't know what to expect. They're so nervous. They don't know what to say. Anybody who's ever been a visa officer has wished that they could actually be on the other side of the window, talk to clients, talk to visa applicants, and help them understand exactly what a consular officer is looking for, how you can make that interview successful, because it is probably one of the most important decisions that can be made in your life, because it decides your relationship with the United States. And, as I mentioned before, in places with high volume like India or China or Brazil or Mexico, we were regularly interviewing close to 200 visa applicants a day. And that meant that we had to make a decision sometimes in just a minute or two, most of the time under 5 minutes. And so that's not very much time that you spend in front of a consular officer. So you really want to get it right. And one of the many complaints that I used to hear about from clients is they would walk up to the window and it felt like they got refused a visa in less than 30 seconds. And they would tell me, you know what, Mandy, they didn't even ask me any questions. I tried to say what I wanted to say, but quickly I was refused and I have no idea what happened. But the second they described to me exactly what unfolded, what questions they were asked, how they answered, I knew exactly what the problems were. And so I was able to help them issue spot. And so this is why we decided to create Argo, because we also just really wanted to share our knowledge and help people understand how we make these decisions, how we do it so quickly. And one interesting thing that most people don't realize is a consular officer or visa officer has absolute power and authority to make a decision on a visa applicant's case. So this means that if I, as a visa officer, decide that somebody doesn't deserve a visa, or they're going to be refused a visa, not even my boss in the consular section or in the visa unit can disagree with me. So nobody has control to change your decision in any way, not even the ambassador. And of course, if you've been refused a visa, you can always reapply. But as you may know, it becomes much more difficult to get a visa the second time or the third time. So it's really a process that you want to get right the very first time when you have a clean slate. And one of the reasons is because from our computer system, your visa record is one entire record, and we can see everything you have ever applied for. So from the time when you were 10 years old and applied for your first tourist visa to when you're applying to go to college in the United States for the first time, a visa officer can see all of that in our systems, and also all of the times you were refused and the notes that we put in every single time to describe what happened, why an officer decided to refuse you. So the next officer can read those notes, understand your situation. And so as you can imagine, if you're applying again, it's basically your word against another consular officer. And for the next consular officer, this person is probably somebody that they already know and that they're friends with, that they eat lunch with every day. So you have to think about, who are they going to side with? The visa officer that they work with every day, or is it going to be, the visa applicant who's applying the second time? So this is why the visa interview is so important. So I'll go a little bit more into detail about Argo later on. Okay, so COVID-19 has had a significant impact on visa processing, as I'm sure you all know. And so let's just look real quick at the timeline of everything that has happened so far. So last December was when the coronavirus broke out in Wuhan, China for the first time. And at that point, nobody knew how much of an impact it was going to have on the world. Okay, so by the end of January, the US government realizes that this is a serious situation in China. And so they give orders for authorized departure of US diplomats who were living and working in China at that time. So the term authorized departure can be a little misleading. It actually means voluntary departure. So it gives all US diplomats living in China at the time the option to leave China only if they choose to. So from what we know now, about 2/3 of US diplomats left China at that time and decided to come back to the US to work in Washington, D.C. And from my colleagues that I know that were living and working in China at the time, the ones who chose to leave tended to be the people who had young children or who were worried whether or not the Chinese government had the situation under control. So they decided to come back. So by the time we got to the middle of March, the US government issued authorized departure orders for all US diplomats working all around the world. So think about that for a minute. This is an unprecedented decision by the US government and has never really happened in the history of the State Department to call back all US diplomats working around the world. So you can see how seriously the US takes the situation. And then a week later, on March 20th, the US government decided to suspend all routine visa services. And again, this is an unprecedented move because visas are actually a very important part of the State Department's work and budget and funding. So all of those machine readable MRV fees, $160 every time you apply for a visa, they go into how the State Department funds its bureaus, its Consular Affairs Bureau, which handles all visa-related issues, which provides the funding for training for U.S. diplomats and for sending consular officers overseas. So again, for them to stop routine visa services, this is a big deal. So then what does that mean if you are a student who plans on studying in the U.S. This year, starting in the fall? Well, obviously it has a significant impact. So generally, fall semester begins in August of September of the year. And so U.S. immigration laws say that a student visa applicant can only apply for a visa, actually can only be issued a visa within 120 days of when they decide to start, when they will start school. So any other year, this would be a very important number and an important date because it just means that visa applicants for student visas can't just apply whenever they want to. They can't apply a year before, just to get prepared. They have to do it within 4 months of when they start school. But this year it's different because there are no visa interviews going on. So nobody is able to get an appointment. Now, what we do know is that in China, at least, and to my knowledge, this is the first location that has opened up visa interview appointment slots starting a few weeks ago for July. And as you can see on here, Beijing and Shenyang, the embassy in Beijing and the consulate in Shenyang will start interviewing people July 6th, Chengdu July 9th, Guangzhou September 10th. And again, this is all just in anticipation. We don't know if actually these appointments will happen, but we can see that the U.S. government is making moves to get prepared to reopen visa operations. And I have just a couple theories about that. One is that at the time when they sent all the U.S. diplomats back from China, only 2/3 of the diplomats left, which means a third decided to stay behind. And so there's probably consular officers who chose to stay behind and can start doing visa work again in July, even though it's not going to be as many as you can do with a full staff. And so it's also possible that with the number of appointments they can do, it's not at full capacity, that they will reserve those for student visa applicants. And this is just a speculation of mine because I know that we believe that student visa applications are incredibly important. All visa officers know that the spring and summer is reserved for student visa applicants because they have this short period of time to get their visas issued, and then to go on to the U.S. within a certain amount of time. So another important rule to know is even once you obtain your U.S. visa, you can't just go to the U.S. whenever you want to. You can actually only enter the U.S. on your student visa 30 days before school starts to get prepared. So it means you can't, arrive 3 months in advance, go on tourism, visit family, go to Disney. No. So with a student visa, you're subject to tighter restrictions. And so only 30 days before can you enter, which means that for this year, at least, if visa interviews resume, there's going to be a very tight turnaround to try to get that visa in hand so students can get to school on time. And so just a quick overview of your interview checklist and what you should bring to your visa interview. So you should always bring your passport with at least 6 months validity left on the passport. You'll want to bring your DS-160 confirmation page. You'll want to bring a recent passport photo taken within the last 6 months. And you'll also want to bring your I-20. And from what I understand, I-20s, traditionally, you have to get your physical hard copy of the I-20 mailed to you by the school. But this year, because of COVID-19, the State Department has stated that they will, accept electronic I-20s, and schools will also be sending out electronic I-20s. So again, this is a very special process for this year. This is not usually how it works. And then the ... signifies other additional documentation you may have to bring. So this will be a little bit different based on the country, but you will want to show evidence that you can pay for your tuition in the U.S. So this may mean bringing bank statements, your personal bank statements, or possibly your parents' bank statements. I know that MPOWER offers letters to show that you are obtaining a loan from them, and that could be, something good to show to the consular officer that you have a plan for how to pay for tuition, which can be very expensive in the U.S. And just some other examples. For example, if you're in China, it's a good idea to bring your housing certificate or your parents' housing certificate. So this is a document that shows that you own real estate in China. And if you own real estate, that means you have, the wealth to attend school in the U.S. and, something that is good to bring. And what I usually mention to my clients is just to make sure that you bring everything you can, because you never know what a consular officer is going to ask for. But also keep in mind that it's possible that they won't look at any of it. They may just want to base their decision entirely on the visa interview, which is actually more likely than not, because as visa officers, we know that all documents can be forged. You can, when I lived in Beijing, you can just walk to the street corner and just buy fake bank documents and bring it into your visa interview. So these officers have learned to not put too much importance in documents. And this is probably also why, for people who have experience with visa interviews, you bring a lot of stuff, and at the end of the day, the officer may not ask for any of it, and that's why. But at the same time, you do want to be prepared just in case they do, because you don't want to be in that position where the officer asks you for bank statements and you don't have it, because that will make them very unhappy. And so just a couple of reminders. Appointments are going to start opening up in the world, probably sooner rather than later. Right now, we have only seen it in China, just because there's such a significant population of international students in China. But I imagine that pretty soon, as things hopefully start getting back to normal, that visa appointments will start becoming available in other countries as well. So you'll want to check the appointment website if you're going to be studying in the U.S. this year. I would check every day just to see if there's any open slots, because you never know. And once it does open, you do want to jump on that appointment as quickly as possible, because in China, for example, now appointments have been grabbed and scheduled out until the end of the year, November or December, that I last heard. So if you're someone that's starting school this year, you want to get that appointment as soon as it opens up. And the next thing is, I cannot emphasize this enough, is how important the visa interview is. The actual visa interview, and not things that you bring, not things that you memorize to say to the consular officer. The actual interview process where you engage with the visa officer and how you present yourself and how you talk to the officer in just that short amount of time is incredibly important, because as I mentioned before, your visa record will last forever. We will see every single time you've approached the U.S. government about a visa issue. So you want to get off on the right foot. Also, once you've been refused a visa, it becomes more difficult to get a visa. And I'll just tell you guys an interesting story is we actually have regulations in place that says that the same visa officer cannot make a decision on the same case twice. So this means that if you were refused by a visa officer and the next time you apply, you get in line, you just accidentally end up back at the same window with the same visa officer, that officer should not actually interview you again, because they've already made a decision on your case. And the reason this law is in place is to really protect the visa applicant so that you get a fresh chance, someone new to look at your case and make a new decision on your case. However, I will have to tell you what actually ends up happening is if you were to go back to the same officer, they would take your case and they would say, oh, I can't interview you again, so I'm going to give you to another officer. And who do you think they're going to give the case to? They're going to give the case to someone who tends to agree with them, someone who is their friend. And unfortunately, this is just the practicality of how it works. When I worked in Beijing, by the time I left, the section was huge. There were 50 visa officers. And visa officers are just like all other people. We tend to, congregate in groups. And there are always the officers that people know will issue anyone. And so you tended to not give your prior refusal cases to those officers because you knew that they were going to overturn your refusal. Instead, you think, oh, I'm going to give it to my visa officer friend, Mike, who always agrees with me, who trusts me in my decisions. And so what will likely happen is this person will get refused again. Unfortunately, it is very unfair, but it is how our system works. And that's why the visa interview is very important. And so what you should do is prepare with the experts and the people who really know how we make these decisions. And so, and this is where Argo really comes in, because we are the only people who have worked behind the visa window. Every Argo officer has interviewed at least 10,000 visa applicants, and some of them many, many more. So for example, I myself have interviewed over 100,000 visa applicants. I'm not really proud to admit that, because you could just imagine how much time I've spent talking to people, trying to understand their situation, making decisions. And so, once you've done this kind of work, you've seen every type of crazy situation. You've refused more people than you would like. And a lot of our visa refusals, we're not entirely sure that you should be refused a visa, but we do know that something in your case makes us hesitate and makes us pause and question what you're saying. And it might be how you look, or not how you look, but more your appearance, how you're dressed, whether you appear nervous or not, your expressions on your face. Are you, normal nervous, like someone who's going to a first-time visa interview? Or are you somebody who is just way too nervous, and that makes the visa officer nervous? And so, and the other thing is, we also observe you while you're in line, long before you're walking up to the window. We're looking at you and being like, oh, are they being nice to our staff at the embassy? Are they treating people nicely? So you want to be nice to everyone the second you start standing in line. And so this is sort of where Argo comes in. And this map shows you all of the locations where our Argo officers have worked. So embassies and consulates around the world, so not just in China, but also in India, in Brazil, in Central America, Mexico, Canada. And we are the largest community of ex-consular officers who are really subject matter experts on what we do, which is the visa interview process, how we make these decisions, what we can see in our computer systems, and how to get it right. And so currently Argo has 28 former consular officers who have worked in over 30 cities. And if you add up all of our years of experience, we have over 9 decades of visa experience. And not only that, we are a robust community. We are connected on Slack. I don't know if you guys know what that is, but it's basically a tech platform that allows us to communicate really quickly. And, people are always getting news from their colleagues who are still in the State Department. Oh, this is what's happening right now in India, or this is what's happening in Brazil. And so we all trade information and we discuss what's going on in the State Department. And so how Argo works is our visa preparation service is all done online on a platform, and we connect applicants seeking U.S. visas with former visa officers for 30-minute one-on-one visa preparation sessions. And it's all done over video conference, which is very, very important because a former visa officer has to be able to see you, see how you respond, how you act, what kinds of answers that you're getting. And so my colleague Rafaela in the chat function is actually going to be sending out a special link to you guys, and probably over email later on today as well, because we have a special link and rate for MPOWER clients and webinar viewers. So feel free to check out our platform. And just a couple of other things that from my experience as a former visa officer is, there's just so many rumors out there and bad information from visa client or visa applicants themselves who have been through the process, who are taking guesses at it, or visa consultants who, are out to just make a few dollars and, they don't really care about the outcome as long as you pay them. And this is something that used to give us so many headaches as visa officers, because one of the things you really want to do during this process is your visa officer is tired and exhausted and talks to a lot of people every day. So you want to help them as much as you can in order to make it easy on them to approve your visa, not make it difficult. One common example that I like to give is, people get meaningful, well-meaning advice from an uncle or an aunt who's been through the process, and they say, hey, try not to say too much during the visa interview, only give them short one-word answers. And as you can imagine, as a former visa, as a visa officer, this traditional trajectory of my questioning would go like, hi, why are you going to the US to study? Okay, study where? Florida. Okay, what school in Florida? The University of Florida. So this was advice that would be given to people applying for a student visa, and they're trying to help this person. But from my experience, you don't want to make it so hard, like pulling teeth for the officer to be able to get the answer out of you. If they should be able to get the same response from you in one question, but it takes them 10 questions to get it, that's not going to make your visa officer very happy. So this is just one of so many different examples that I can give you, and it's different and it's subjective and it's based on each person's experience. But what I can say is, as Argo officers, we can just help you feel confident about the most important interview of your life, and to let you understand what you can expect, help you issue spot in your areas of weakness, things that you should probably brush up on and prepare better for. And we're the only people in the world that know how to do that. And I'm a U.S. immigration attorney. And even when I left government and I started working with a lot of other immigration attorneys, I realized that not even immigration attorneys really know how the visa interview process works, because they've never done the job. And so again, I hope you guys will give us a shot. We do really want to be here to help. I have to say, I was definitely one of the toughest visa officers in all of the places that I have worked, for better or for worse, mostly because I took my job very seriously. But now I'm also in the best position to help clients to tackle this very formidable process. And so thank you for all of your time. Now I would like to open up the floor for any questions that you may have, whether you want to type it into the chat, or I'm not sure, you can just straight out ask.
Thank you so much for this session, Mandy. I admit I did not know majority of the insights you provided about the process. And to be honest, there's so much ambiguity and so many sources out there which talk about a possible visa process and how to train for a visa and a visa interview. That it's very hard for an aspirant to decide what to believe and what not to believe. And yes, it's nice to hear information from a source that is credible, that has been in part of the system, understand it throughout, and can, guide you in the best possible way. So really, thank you so much for that. And with that, we now open for questions. Anybody who wants to ask anything, please feel free to type it in the chat box. Mandy will address that question. There's one question that I thought, I wanted to understand. Should we always, because there are certain documents that you carry with yourself when you're going for that interview. So is it always, and not all the time, the visa officer would ask for those documents. And at times, a lot of students have shared that they felt that, the visa officer did not really go through their application properly. If they would have just asked for that document, it would have made sense. In retrospect, they think that just offer the document upfront without maybe, the visa officer asking for it. So does that make sense? Or
yeah, so I would not recommend that you do that. So of course, you'll want to provide the key documentation like your passport and DS-160. And so that's very important. But one of our least favorite things is for an applicant to shove all of this paperwork through the window before we have asked for it. It's actually one of our biggest pet peeves. So I'm so glad you asked that question. We really do not like that. And so I would wait until the officer actually asks you for something. And a lot of the times, what people don't understand is, applicants will even say to me, like, everything is in the letter, just look at the letter. And I'll say, I don't want to see what's in the letter. I want to hear it from you. Where are you going? What are you doing? Oh, and for taking the MPOWER letter as an example, I might want to hear the applicant tell me how, they were able to go through the loan process. I wouldn't want to just see a letter. And most of it is because I want to actually engage with the applicant and understand their situation and not spend my time reading through letters, which doesn't tell me much of anything. And for the most part, I think that most consular officers are in agreement to that point. We all think no documents because they can all be forged and faked. And what can't be faked is the visa interview process and actually talking to this person standing in front of me who wants to go to the US, and we want to understand why.
So a lot of guidance around the internet says that whenever you apply for that visa interview date or the time slot, you should go for a really early morning slot, because the visa are pretty fresh in that time. They haven't really taken a lot of interviews so early in the, and they're more inclined to approve you for that particular visa. Is that so?
I think that is true. I think that we tend to be in better moods first thing in the morning because it's before you've talked to 150 people. So, you tend to be fresher. By the time it's the end of the day, you tend to be very tired. And there's a lot of decision-making fatigue that comes along with the job, where it's very tiring to make these decisions in a few minutes. And we understand how important these decisions are. And we actually hate refusing people, but it's just part of the job, And so, unfortunately, sometimes that's why we're cranky or we're not very nice. It's because, you think that you're the first person that we have asked that question to, but actually we've already asked that question at least like 100 times.
So another question I have always come across, and there's a very huge speculation about it on various forums and chat rooms, that while selecting a consulate for a visa interview, there are certain consulates that are more inclined and more easy to convince for a visa interview, and there are certain consulates which do not really want to, approve, or maybe a little have a much more stricter decision-making process.
Yes.
Is it a speculation or is it actually true?
I think it is true to a certain extent because everybody has different applicant profiles. So, for example, when I worked in Beijing, it was consistently true that the consulate in Shenyang was tougher. They had a much higher refusal rate than in Beijing, but they also had good reason for it because we would do something called validation studies where we, did tests to see how many people used their visas properly, how many people would come back on time, how many people would actually come back at all. And there tended to be more fraud in the Shenyang consular district than there was in Beijing, which meant that there was a higher refusal rate. But as I mentioned before, consular officers don't really like it when you're applying outside of your consular district unless you have a very good reason for doing so. And I'll give you an example of a good reason. So if you are, studying in Texas, but, you're a Chinese passport holder and it would take a lot of effort to go back to China and you decide to fly up to Canada to apply for a visa. And you may come up with like an excuse like, oh, I'm just in Canada for vacation. That's not a good enough reason. But if you're someone who has actually been a green card holder of Canada for over 10 years, and that's where you live, even though you still hold a Chinese passport, that would be a good enough reason for you to be applying in Canada, which is essentially your second home. Of course, now, given the impact of the coronavirus, I do think that officers will be a little bit more lenient about where you apply, assuming that you give them good reason for it. So I'll give you an example. Most of the consulates and the embassy in China have visa appointments available right now, but Shanghai does not have any student visa appointments available. So what I would tell clients who live in Shanghai, because there's no available appointments, but there are other places, I would say I would apply somewhere else, but explain to the consular officer that, you're not able to apply in your home consular district. And I think that they would be more understanding. Okay. So this is a very special time. And so, normal rules don't necessarily apply. And also when the coronavirus first happened, there were a lot of visa holders already living in the U.S. that were afraid to travel very far. So they were going to places in the Caribbean or going to Mexico to apply. And we call those cases third country national cases because the person isn't applying in their home country. But I think it was more accepted then because we understood the risks of traveling far distances or having to travel back to China, especially when there was an immigration ban and a quarantine order in place.
Ooh. So there's another question by a Nigerian MBA admit. He asked that for an F1 visa application, is it seen as a negative by the consular officer if a portion of the proof of funds is provided by a sibling currently living in the US?
Not necessarily. I think I would have to understand the situation a little bit more. If for example, it depends on the sibling situation. If the sibling is a PhD student, working his way to become a professor at a school. The family is very well-to-do, and the rest of the family is all back in Nigeria. I think that would probably be fine if this person is going to study in the U.S. But if the sibling is, working in a fast food restaurant and has, claimed asylum and is, has maybe done some things that the visa officer doesn't necessarily approve of, that could be a different story. So it really depends on each situation and can be, probably will need a little more detail to know if it's a true negative factor.
Cool. So there is another question. The person asked that, hello, ma'am, my current university has sent me SEVIS, SEVIS ID and number. Should we register the DS-160 form now? And would it impact if any deferral happens?
I would say you should wait until you have your I-20 before you register for an appointment. But again, it depends on, how far out the appointment process goes. So if it's going to be months before you can get an appointment, maybe you can do it now. But I would recommend that you have all of your documentation before you sign up for an appointment. if any are available.
Understood. And I think you are in a best way to answer this question. What are the impacts of previous visa denials to an application? What advice do you have for such a person?
I would say that the next visa appointment is very, very important, because you don't want to be one of those people that just gets denied over and over again. And I've actually seen a lot of people like that, where they've been denied 6 times, 7 times, and just crazy numbers of times, because every single time there's additional notes in the system by a different visa officer who have, engaged with you, decided that for some reason you shouldn't have a visa. And so it's important to take each session very seriously and make sure that, you talk to somebody. I would definitely recommend that you use Argo and speak to one of our former visa officers and describe what happened before to have caused you to be refused the visa, because it might be something that you don't realize is a problem. But when you talk to somebody who has done this type of work, then they can immediately say, oh, I know what they're thinking. I know what the problem is. So let's try to help you remedy that problem, or help you be able to explain that in a way that the consular officer will understand it. And so I think that unless I know the specific situation, it'll be hard to give very specific advice.
Makes sense. And so this person got his US F1 visa, but due to travel restrictions in India, he had to defer his date to next year. Does he again need to reapply for an F1 visa, or would the same one work?
So I think it depends on, so the same visa should work, assuming that the underlying I-20 is valid and that he still has, the underlying basis to be in the U.S., because then you already have your visa.
So you said that the documents, are always secondary, and the interaction is always the first thing that a consular officer would actually look at.
Yes.
So will that mean that the documents are verified or maybe not verified when this happens?
No, there's no verification process, because we know that, anything can be just photocopied and given to somebody else, or the name taken off. And honestly, this is the whole point of the visa interview, is to actually speak to you as a person. If we really wanted to look at documents, then we wouldn't even interview you. We would just say, hey, send us your documents. We'll look it over and decide. But the problem is that, the human to human interaction is very important to us. The State Department calls us human lie detectors. So you can imagine how important they think it is that, we're observing your expressions, how you answer. Are you nervous? Are you confident? All of these things are very, very important. And the thing is, I completely understand how stressful of a process this can be. For many people, especially if they're applying for the very first time and the first time talking to a U.S. immigration official, you don't want to do the wrong thing or say the wrong thing. So understandably, you'll be nervous. But what we're looking for is this person more nervous than normal? So again, it could be difficult for the applicant. And so, and going back to the person who asked previously, if I've been refused a visa, what are some tips? I would say, just try to have confidence, and try to, if you think why you were refused before, try to have a good explanation for why that isn't really a negative factor in your case.
Understood. And will the university rank have an effect on the decision, or in any way on the process?
The rank of the university, not really, as long as it makes sense why you're going there or why you chose the school. I've had students tell me, hey, I applied to 5 schools, but actually this is the one that just really the only one that I can afford, or, that has the best program. And I think as long as it makes sense to the consular officer, it's fine. But it is a problem if it's a university you chose, but you don't even actually know what city it's located in. That's seen as a big red flag for us.
Now the process will start in some time. Will there be any leniency provided towards students for visa slots, since students would have their admissions deferred and they're already, the classes have already started? So would there be like a preference in the process for maybe an F1 visa for students, or any kind of, maybe any other student visa that people would be applying to?
It's really hard to say what the government will actually do, but I think that they will give preference to student visa applicants. And this is just my speculation based on my past experience, because when I was working in China, the appointment times, wait times were very, very long. And I remember there was a time when we specifically gave priority to student visa applicants because we know that they had to get to school on time. Whereas people who are going for tourism or going for vacation, they can really go anytime. And so we did tend to prioritize student visas, especially in the spring and summer. So I hope the same will happen, but we'll just have to be patient and see.
I think we're well past the limit. Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us here today.
Thank you, everyone.